Have you ever believed that history was already decided, that the great powers had drawn their lines on the map long before you were born, and that smaller nations were only meant to adapt, to obey, or to quietly endure? Have you ever felt that the world had already agreed on who matters and who does not, who leads and who follows, who is remembered and who is forgotten? For decades, there was a quiet assumption whispered in diplomatic halls and military briefings, repeated so often it sounded like truth. The Philippines was important once, they said, strategic once, relevant once. But that time had passed. It was an insult delivered softly, never shouted, never written in bold letters, but felt deeply all the same. A belief that the Philippines was merely a leftover chapter of the Cold War, a former base, a former ally, a former asset. That when the United States left Subic Bay in the early 1990s, it closed a door forever. That history had moved on. And strangely, much of the world seemed to nod along, as if this idea required no debate. Even respected voices echoed it. Analysts, professors, retired generals. One well-known security scholar once said in a televised lecture that Southeast Asia would eventually tilt inevitably toward a single power, and that countries like the Philippines would have no meaningful choice in the matter. His words were calm, confident, final, and no one challenged him. The silence that followed felt like agreement. But what if that confidence was misplaced? What if the story was not finished, only paused? What if the ground beneath those assumptions was already shifting, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to speak? Because something unusual began happening, not in Washington or Beijing, but along a familiar stretch of Philippine coastline, Subic Bay, a place many thought belonged to the past, a name spoken with nostalgia, not urgency. And yet, slowly at first, then unmistakably, Subic began to reappear in conversations that mattered. Military planners returned, engineers took notes, diplomats asked questions they had not asked in decades. Ships came back, not as visitors passing through, but as signals. At the center of this moment stands a man few people outside policy circles would recognize. An American naval officer, now in his late 50s, who first set foot in Subic as a young lieutenant before the bases closed. Back then, he believed, like everyone else, that this chapter was ending. He packed his bags thinking he would never return. History, after all, had moved on. He did not know that 30 years later, he would stand on the same pier again, older, quieter, and profoundly unsettled by what he was witnessing. Not just the return of American ships, but the return of something else. Philippine confidence, Philippine resolve, Philippine choice. And as he looked out over the bay, watching Filipino dock workers move with calm efficiency, hearing church bells echo faintly beyond the port, he realized something that would trouble him deeply. This was not about America coming back. This was about the Philippines standing its ground. And that realization would force him, and many like him, to rethink everything they thought they knew about power, loyalty, and the future of this region. The officer's name is Daniel Harper, and his journey back to Subic did not begin with strategy or rivalry. It began with doubt. Years before his return, Harper had grown disillusioned. He had served in the Middle East, watched alliances fracture in Europe, and witnessed promises dissolve when they became inconvenient. He saw nations hedge, retreat, compromise. He saw smaller countries pressured into silence, forced to choose between survival and sovereignty. In briefing rooms, the tone had changed. China was no longer spoken of as a rising power, but as an inevitable one. The language shifted from prevention to accommodation, from balance to acceptance. Harper listened as colleagues argued that resistance was futile, that regional partners would eventually fall in line. It was not said cruelly, just pragmatically, as if history itself had made the decision. He saw the consequences firsthand. In ports across Asia, agreements were rewritten. In capitals across Europe, defenses weakened. Even in the United States, there was fatigue, a quiet desire to step back, to let others handle the burden of order. Harper began to wonder whether loyalty still existed in international affairs, or whether everything had become transactional. Personally, he was struggling too. A lingering illness from years at sea left him exhausted. His sense of purpose faded. The institution he had dedicated his life to no longer felt certain of itself. He considered early retirement, a quiet life far from policy debates and strategic maps. It was during this period of uncertainty that Subic Bay resurfaced in conversation. Not loudly, not dramatically, just as an option. A possibility, a place where cooperation might still mean something. At first, Harper dismissed it. He remembered the political tension, the protests, the closure. He remembered the narrative. The Philippines had chosen distance. Why would it choose differently now? But the requests kept coming. Joint exercises, logistics coordination, infrastructure assessments, always with an unmistakable tone of invitation, not dependency. The Philippines was not asking to be protected. It was asking to cooperate. When Harper finally arrived in Manila for preliminary talks, he expected formality, caution, perhaps resentment. Instead, he encountered something unexpected. Calm confidence, clear boundaries. Filipino officials spoke openly about their concerns, their history, their faith, and their future. They did not sound desperate. They sounded resolved. He visited communities near former bases. He saw schools built where barracks once stood, churches filled on weekdays, not just Sundays, families who remembered the closure not with bitterness, but with dignity. One elderly man told him softly, "We stood on our own for a while, now we stand with friends, but on our feet." That sentence stayed with him. Still, Harper remained cautious. He had seen hopeful moments collapse before. He wondered whether this was symbolic rather than substantive, whether Subic was being revived in name only, whether the Philippines could truly withstand the pressure it was facing. And yet, as meetings continued, one truth became harder to ignore. This was not a country being pulled back into an old alliance. This was a country stepping forward, fully aware of the risks, fully conscious of its history, choosing engagement not out of fear, but out of principle. For the first time in years, Harper felt something he had not felt in a long while. Not certainty, but purpose returning. When Harper finally traveled to Subic Bay itself, he expected nostalgia. What he encountered instead was transformation. The old landmarks were there, but they had been repurposed, modernized, integrated into civilian life. Filipino engineers walked him through facilities designed not for domination, but for partnership. There was no grandstanding, no theatrics, just quiet capability. What struck him most was not the infrastructure, but the people. Filipino officers spoke with clarity about their role in the region. They did not frame their position as opposition to any one country, but as defense of something deeper: sovereignty, dignity, the right to choose one's friends without coercion. Harper noticed something else, too: the absence of fear. There was awareness of the risks, yes, but not panic. When asked about pressure from larger powers, one Filipino commander simply said, "We have lived through empires. We are still here." In the evenings, Harper walked through the town. He watched families gather for meals, heard laughter spill from modest homes, saw young people pray quietly before exams, before work, before decisions that would shape their lives. Faith was not a performance here. It was woven into daily resilience. He spoke with dock workers whose parents remembered American departure and whose children now saw international ships return. They did not speak of revenge or regret. They spoke of opportunity and responsibility. One man told him, "If we do nothing, we lose everything. If we stand, at least we stand as Filipinos." That sentence echoed the earlier one, spoken by the elderly man in Manila. A pattern was emerging, a national character revealing itself not through speeches, but through steady conviction. Harper began to see the broader picture. The return to Subic was not about military dominance. It was about geography, yes, but also about values, trust, mutual respect, shared sacrifice. The Philippines was not aligning blindly. It was asserting its place, reminding the world that it had not vanished from history's map. For the first time, Harper understood why this mattered beyond strategy. In a world where power often bullied principle, the Philippines was demonstrating something rare: courage without arrogance, partnership without submission. He realized then that this was not a warning shouted toward China. It was a statement spoken calmly to everyone. The Philippines would not be erased. As weeks turned into months, Harper found himself staying longer than planned. He attended Mass with local families. He listened to fishermen speak about disputed waters with a mix of frustration and faith. He watched young Filipino sailors train with intensity, not because they hated anyone, but because they loved their country. There were moments that moved him deeply. A simple prayer offered before a joint exercise. A shared meal after a long day where rank dissolved and laughter took its place. A handwritten note from a Filipino officer thanking him not for protection, but for respect. Harper had served in many places. He had never seen this combination of humility and strength, of warmth and resolve. The Philippines was not pretending to be something it was not. It knew its limitations, but it also knew its worth. Internally, something shifted. The cynicism he carried began to loosen its grip. He remembered why he joined the Navy in the first place, not to dominate, but to defend an order where choices mattered. One night, standing near the water, he watched the lights of Subic reflect on the bay. He realized he no longer saw this place as a former base. He saw it as a living symbol of a nation that endured colonization, war, abandonment, and still emerged with its soul intact. He thought of the analysts who said resistance was futile, of the professors who spoke of inevitability. He understood now how wrong they were. History is not inevitable. It is chosen day by people willing to stand. The Philippines had stood. When Harper eventually returned to Washington, he carried more than reports and recommendations. He carried a story that challenged assumptions. He spoke of Subic not as a strategic asset, but as a moral anchor. He reminded colleagues that alliances are strongest when both sides choose each other freely. Some listened skeptically, others quietly agreed. But the shift had begun, not just in policy, but in perception. Subic Bay was no longer a memory. It was a message that smaller nations are not destined to disappear, that faith and resilience are strategic strengths, that dignity can shape geopolitics as much as power. For Filipinos, this moment carried deeper meaning. It affirmed what they had always known about themselves, that they are not merely survivors of history, but authors of it, that their values are not weaknesses, but foundations. For the world, it offered a quiet lesson. In an age of noise and intimidation, the Philippines spoke softly and stood firmly. And perhaps that is the most powerful warning of all. Not one delivered through threats, but through example. Today, as ships once again anchor in Subic Bay, the story continues. Not as a return to the past, but as a step into a future shaped by choice. The Philippines has reminded the world that sovereignty is not granted by size, but by courage. Daniel Harper knows this now. He knows that the most important battles are not always fought with weapons, but with resolve. He knows that history listens closely to those who refuse to be erased. And as the sun rises over Subic Bay, illuminating a harbor reborn not in fear, but in purpose, one truth becomes clear. The Philippines did not wait to be rescued. It stood. It chose. And in doing so, it changed the conversation for everyone watching. Because the rise of Subic Bay is not about the United States returning. It is about the Philippines reminding the world who it has always been.